So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tom Miles. I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Law School for this exciting event. Since its founding, the University of Chicago has dedicated itself to the celebration and protection of the freedom of expression as an essential element of the university's culture and mission of scholarly excellence and transformative education. The university seeks the discovery, refinement, and sharing of knowledge. The aspiration of our faculty is to expand the boundaries of human knowledge and understanding. As the university's Latin motto states, let knowledge grow from more to more. And the university has believed that to do this, the faculty should be free to pursue any intellectual inquiry that presents itself. And the university has sought to foster an environment of deep discourse and free expression in which ideas are investigated, questioned, defended, honed, and questioned again. In addition to its relationship to our research mission, the freedom of expression is indispensable to our educational mission. An education that includes a broad exposure to and searching evaluation of contrasting ideas on important topics provides a great development of the mind and an excellent preparation for the careers of our graduates. Over time, the university has sought to advance these goals and these values in several ways. It has convened important faculty committees, such as the 2015 Committee on the Freedom of Expression, to articulate these principles. Also, since 1961, the university has held an annual Aims of Education address to introduce incoming college students to the purposes of liberal education. And excitingly, this year, the university advanced this commitment in a new way through the founding of the Sam and Helen Zell event series. This series features leading scholars discussing the challenges facing free expression and academic freedom. And this series began with a great inaugural event in November. And we are grateful for the opportunity to explore the challenges, prospects, and meaning of free expression through the Zell series. Sam and Helen Zell have been longtime supporters of equal opportunity in education, free expression, and academic freedom. We thank them for their generous support that has made this series possible. And so today we are delighted to continue this series. The way we'll proceed is that we'll have remarks from our special guest, followed by commentary from a faculty colleague, and then open up to Q&A. I'll begin by introducing both our speaker and our faculty commentator. And we are honored to welcome today's guest speaker, Pratap Mehta. He is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Distinguished Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University. He is a leading scholar of political theory and of democracy. He has published widely on the history of ideas, the Indian Constitution, and politics in India. Professor Mehta received his undergraduate degree from Oxford and his PhD in politics from Princeton. He's held teaching positions at Harvard, Ashoka University, NYU Law School, among others. He was the Vice-Chancellor of Ashoka University and the President of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi, one of India's leading think tanks. He has served on many government committees as well as editorial boards of leading scholarly journals such as the American Political Science Review and the Journal of Democracy. In addition to his scholarly work, Professor Mehta is a frequent commentator on public affairs, and we are honored to welcome him today as part of the Zell event series. I'm also delighted that Professor Mehta will be in dialogue with our colleague, Professor Aziz Z. Professor Huck is the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law at the Law School. He is an award-winning scholar of U.S. and comparative constitutional law, and he has a broad range of intellectual interests. He has written on topics from national security to preemption doctrine to AI to standing doctrine. His most recent book, The Collapse of Constitutional Remedies, examines how legal doctrines such as qualified immunity have prevented independent courts from providing remedies for state violations of constitutional rights. In addition to his influential scholarship, Professor Huck is an outstanding teacher, having received our Graduating Students Award for Teaching Excellence. He had a distinguished career before joining the law school, including having clerked for the Honorable Robert Sachs on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit and for Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the U.S. Supreme Court. We're thrilled that he will be providing commentary today. So we'll first start with Professor Mehta's remarks, followed by Professor Huck's commentary, and then we'll open to Q&A from our audience. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Professor Mehta.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm deeply grateful to the President of the University of Chicago, the Dean of the Law School, Professor Miles, Professor Tom Ginsburg, for really giving me this extraordinary opportunity to think aloud with you on a matter of concern to all of us. And I'm grateful to the University of Chicago for taking such an intellectual lead on the matter of intellectual freedom and freedom of expression more generally. I'm also grateful to Professor Huck for stepping in at short notice. We will miss Professor Nussbaum, but I think we'll be more than adequately compensated. And above all, I'm grateful to all of you for being here. When Professor Ginsburg wrote to me, I think the sense I had of this occasion was this is an occasion for thinking collectively and thinking aloud about a common predicament that faces universities in many liberal democracies. What is the future of academic freedom? Right? And my remarks are going to be offered in that spirit of thinking aloud. This is not a formal academic paper. And whenever one thinks of freedom of speech, one's torn between adopting two contradictory impulses, right? Either you can follow Mark Twain's advice that America has perfect freedom of expression and the good sense never to use it, or you can follow the advice that somebody wrote once in a review of John Locke, what's the point of writing if nobody wants to cut your head off it? And I must confess, both are very tempting options. So let's see. Let me also say at the outset, I'm not going to discuss the concept of academic freedom much. I don't think I need to discuss it in this context, and much has been written and said on this. If there are issues that come up, we can discuss in the question and answer. I'll just lay my cards on the table, just kind of by way of stipulation. Academic freedom and freedom of expression more generally are two distinct ideas, but they're both very valuable ideas. I have no hesitation in endorsing the Chicago principles as they're broadly understood. My own view is that most attempts to regulate speech, including academic speech, are counterproductive. We all understand that speech takes place in the context of unequal relations of power. We also understand, and I think should acknowledge, that words wound, they actually matter. Academic speech is never just academic in that sense. Nevertheless, I think there are good practical grounds for resisting regulation as much as you can. The practical ground simply being that it's my sense as a political scientist that the minute you create a regulatory regime that actually opens up the possibility of regulation based on some very fine-grained distinctions we want to make between classes of speech, what you will get as a result is a politics of competitive mobilization asking for more and more regulation. Take this as a sort of empirical thesis in some ways. But I think more importantly, normatively, I think the presumption that people need to be protected from speech, to me, that's a far greater affront to those people than I think any wounding or affront that might result as a consequence of speech. I think there's a kind of paternalism there that I personally think actually is probably more offensive and does more damage. The idea that we can't take speech on its own terms, I think, is a damaging sentiment and proposition. Now, we all know academic freedom is under attack in different kinds of ways and in different contexts globally. You can look at cases of Turkey, you can look at Hungary. I'll talk about India a little bit briefly, but I'll try and place India in a kind of comparative context. And before I get to why this might be the case, the thrust of my talk is going to be that rather than discuss what academic freedom is, we need to ask slightly more difficult questions about why is it and under what conditions do societies cease to value academic freedom. I think that's actually the more interesting political challenge in front of us, at least for all of us in this room who are committed to the idea of academic freedom. So before I come to that question, I just want to make two remarks about the institutional context in which there is an attack on academic freedom across the world, particularly in India. One is a very strange kind of institutional context, and William Mazzarella, who's at the University of Chicago, I think drew our attention to this phenomenon a few years ago. That one of the interesting things about the contemporary logic of censorship is that it actually seeks to draw attention to the thing being censored, right? It is almost as if it is a play of power rather than an attempt or a fantasy to actually erase what is being censored. And in that sense, if you look at the debate over freedom of expression in our time more generally, you have both phenomenon, at least in a country like India. There is extraordinary censoriousness, but there is also an extraordinary availability, in some senses, of the very thing that is being censored, right? And I think it's important to bear this point in mind because I think it also explains why, at least in a country like India, even though everybody acknowledges that academic freedom is in peril, there is almost a kind of casual kind of blaseness about it, as if there's something very performative in what is actually going on, right? Those who are censoring know that by the act of censoring, they're actually going to draw more attention. And they don't yet have the technologies, in some senses, perhaps China does, to actually make the thought being censored, the publication being censored, unavailable in a literal sense. The second institutional context, again, very important in the Indian case, and I'll elaborate on this in a little bit, is the formal protections that you have either for freedom of expression or academic freedom are not a very good predictor about the practices those states will engage in to curb academic freedom. In some ways, in Indian public universities, for example, the formal protections that faculty have are probably better than anywhere in the world. I mean, it's virtually impossible to fire anyone, just to take in that instance. And yet, as we are seeing with modern authoritarian regimes, the state can use quotidian administrative practices, right, to punish, penalize, deter freedom of expression. I mean, just to give you a very quotidian example, there's one public university in India where the Vice-Chancellor docked the pensions of 43 faculty members who was about to retire on some technicality. They all eventually won their cases in court, but actually many of them passed away before their matters were settled. I mean, that's just the most quotidian example, but you can think of a whole range of administrative techniques. And I think part of the way academic freedom is being regulated is the way in which there's an analogy in the way in which the state actually uses administrative measures to deter speech. I think just keep this institutional background in mind. Now let's ask the question, under what political conditions does academic freedom become precarious? And I'm going to speak more generally. I'm more confident that these conditions apply to India, but others can, make a call how applicable they are elsewhere. So the first condition, and let me just state this as a pointed proposition, I won't argue for this here. Freedom of expression is always at risk when it collides with the demands of sovereign power. If you remember from Immanuel Kant to Max Weber, those who argued for freedom of academic speech insisted that one of the ways in which you make academic speech free is by insisting it is just academic speech. It's the private use of reason in some ways, right? Academic freedom is at risk, not when it questions authority. I think most sovereign states are quite comfortable with that. But when they construe those questions to pose a risk, right, to the fundamental existence of the state. And if you pose the question this way, the question we have to ask is not what rights do we have, what principles of academic freedom do we defend. The question we have to ask is, when does the sovereign power think that you actually pose a threat to it? That is actually the political question, right? Now, historically, there's one very simple answer to that question that states have given, which is when speech constitutes a threat to national security, right, including academic speech, that speech can be regulated. As we famously say, the Constitution is not a suicide pact, right? And one of the most remarkable phenomenon of our time is, in a sense, the expansion of this ambit of the national security state. So if you look at the kinds of things on which the Indian state will intervene in academic freedom, topics relating to discussions of Kashmir, militant violence, right? All being framed, right, under, in a sense, the imperative of reason of state and state security. But no state is immune from this challenge. And I think that's the interesting question. How do they expand the definition of national security such that it becomes a threat even to ordinary academic discourse? The second element of this story, which is pertinent to our times, is the interests of the state expand if power is more personalized, right? India is going through a moment of democratic authoritarianism. And one of the things that is often hard to do for journalists, for academics, is in university settings to, for example, openly criticize the prime minister and not have to suffer consequences for doing so, right? But we know in some senses, right, that the personalization of political power, right, because in some senses it merges the personality with the state, construes the criticism of the person of the prime minister with, in some ways, the criticism of the state. And it's not an accident that the three populist democracies, Hungary, Turkey, and India, are actually witnessing just that fusion of state power and personalistic politics, right? Another way of, in a sense, expanding. And the third element is when states begin to redefine or position a new form of nationalism, right? I think one of the features of contemporary ideologies of nationalism, particularly in countries like India and elsewhere, is the idea that there needs to be a collective national myth. That collective national myth should allow for a guilt-free existence of all citizens, not confront hard questions about its past, right? This myth often takes a majoritarian form and seeks to preserve the cultural privileges of an ethnic majority, right? And anything that challenges that myth is likely to expose you to the charge that you're about to subvert the state. And if you look at all clampdowns of freedom of expression in India, broadly, it's in these three categories that they actually come, right? But in the Indian context, there's one other, I think, larger legal point that I think needs to be borne in mind. As many of you know, those of you know the law of freedom of expression in India, India has lots of laws regulating freedom of expression, particularly laws that protect religion from offensive speech, right? At least speech undertaken with malicious intent to offend religion. Now, what this has done to India's conception of citizenship is that, in a sense, it has institutionalized the idea of what I call the kind of blasphemy paradigm of speech, that there are forms of speech that can offend communities or religions. Article 295A, for example, of the Indian Penal Code, right? Now, one of the challenges, I think, for those of us who are defending freedom of expression within the academy is how can you reconcile the fact that your conception of citizenship is placed on institutionalizing this blasphemy paradigm, and yet expect exemptions for academic speech, right? So if you look at the most prominent attacks on academic freedom in India, the chopping off of the arm of a lecturer in Kerala because he set an exam question on the Quran, the ABVP, the BJP student wing's routine vigilante violence against different forms of cultural expression, the taking off of A.K. Ramanujan's essay on Ramayana and the Freud from the syllabus of Delhi University, right? They all take recourse to this idea that blasphemy, I mean, I'm calling it the blasphemy paradigm, it's not blasphemy in the literal sense. This is an established canon of Indian citizenship that all communities have recourse to, right? And in a sense, what they're trying to do is bring that discourse into the academy. When I was Vice-Chancellor, most of the complaints were essentially this textbook offends that community, this textbook offends, the founder of this religion, and so on and so forth, right? And so the question for Indian liberals in particular is, we failed to challenge that blasphemy paradigm in our public construction of citizenship. We were quite okay saying that Indian secularism meant that the public space is a safe space for all religions, right? They need to be protected from offensive speech. And in some senses, what has happened is, now the political establishment, in a sense, just takes those restrictions and moves that back in. Here's a mischievous thought for the US, that if actually the idea of safe spaces get institutionalized in the academy, is there a possibility that it actually moves out at some point into thinking about First Amendment protections? You can see the movement in the other direction, right? So reclaiming academic freedom will involve radically questioning the larger regulation of free speech that has characterized Indian constitutionalism since independence. Very quickly now, why is there no resistance to the widespread crackdown on academic freedom in India, right? I mean, I think that's the interesting political question. No political party in India, none, wants to bat for academic freedom. Most state government, political parties at the state government, deploy the same paradigm that the BJP does, which is protect regional ethnic identities from what they deem to be offensive speech, protect the chief minister and their form of personalized power from offensive speech, whether you take West Bengal, whether you take Tamil Nadu. So the paradigm that the Hindu nationalist government is using is actually a paradigm that has already been perfected at the state level. There's also a precedent for this. If you ask the question, what is the model that the BJP government has in mind? I think that fantasy is actually what the Communist Party of India did in West Bengal in the 1970s and 1980s. The complete decimation of a system of higher education through state forms of ideological control. So there's a good deal of kind of whataboutery, as it's called, right? That there just isn't a political constituency that is actually deeply committed to freedom of expression. Second, very quickly, when we talk of academic freedom, in different institutional contexts, it means different things. So here at the University of Chicago, if I asked a professor a question, what do you mean by academic freedom? One of the things they might say is the freedom to assign whatever we wish in our reading lists and syllabi. subject to some basic controls, but you broadly get the idea. But think of academic systems where 99% of the professoriate have never had their freedom, because the syllabi have always been centrally controlled by committees. In fact, the meaning of the syllabus has a very different status. It is a set of authoritative texts that have been legislated in some senses by an anonymous committee to which you teach. So at the margins, and why the conflicts over syllabi are so zero-sum game is partly because that kind of institutional autonomy that professors at an individual level take for granted has pretty much never existed for most Indian professors. So, there's no mobilization around that. The third question, and just two final points to end with very quickly, is much of the target for the clampdown of academic freedom in India particularly is disciplines like history, literature, and broadly the social sciences, right? So one of the things that does is it kind of bifurcates the sciences off from the social sciences. And in the public perception, there's a kind of sense that actually the pursuit of truth still goes on in universities, even if you can marginalize a few historians and social scientists. It's not surprising that this is the case for three reasons. One, because these are the disciplines most directly engaged with narratives about nationalism and community identity. Second, let us be candid and acknowledge that these are also disciplines where projecting authoritative disciplinary standards to a larger public is very difficult. We might be convinced that as a community of social scientists and historians, we have authoritative disciplinary standards. I think large parts of the public are actually not convinced. They think in some senses that the practice of disciplinary standards is simply another exercise in excluding rival forms of inquiry and rival truths. And I think as universities, we have to face this challenge head on. And they think that by and large what the universities have done in the name of academic freedom is claimed a certain kind of exemption for disciplinary power, right? This has generated broadly a crisis of credibility about the social sciences and history and disciplines like the humanities in the eyes of the larger public. And if you are going to rescue academic freedom from the kind of indifference that it seems to be subject to from larger publics, we will have to face this crisis of credibility squarely. We'll have to ask tough questions. We say the university is a place committed to the pursuit of truth, and I firmly believe it is, and I firmly believe that's the practice of most scholars. But the disciplinary practices of our university actually privilege, take the 4 B words, right? Parsimony, product differentiation, paradigm in some ways. The way these disciplinary practices are communicated to the larger public, they think, as I said, that these disciplinary practices are actually mechanisms of exclusion. They're always partial. They oversell their status as truth claims. And one of the interesting things is how much the right has internalized the critique the left used to have of knowledge, right? And so I submit to you that if you want to recover the cherished ideal of academic freedom, we'll have to engage both with larger regulatory regimes of freedom of expression and also more squarely confront the crisis of credibility within the university. One of the greatest university presidents ever, Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, were the founders of Calcutta University, in a convocation address, ended his speech this way. He said, "I plead for freedom in the university. This is the very condition of a vigorous existence in an institution engaged in the search for truth. Keep your university free from baneful influence of dogmas. Their domination is equally deleterious, whatever the source, be it official, political, religious, or academic. Indeed, the corporate repressive action of the university, which fails to link by a golden thread the experience of the past with the aspirations of the future, may be as potent a factor of mischief as external, non-academic interferences with our freedom. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Mehta, for those rich and rewarding remarks. I know that it is appropriate to start by conveying what I know Professor Nussbaum would have wanted to say had she been able to be here, which is that it's not just that Professor Mehta offers us such a rich intellectual reflection on academic freedom, but he offers us a lived example of the commitment to those values under circumstances of some personal cost. Few scholars are called upon to defend articulately the value of academic freedom in their lived practice. Fewer yet meet that challenge when they face it. And we must be immensely grateful to Professor Mehta for the courage and constancy that his example offers, quite beyond his remarks. I want to make two comments upon Professor Mehta's remarks today. Both of them move from what I see as a premise of all that he has said today. The premise of his remarks is that academic freedom is not just a complex institutional practice, but it confronts a complex series of threats and challenges. These come not just from students resisting speech within the walls of a university, but from society, and in particular, the state. And Professor Mehta, I think, rightly reminds us that it is not merely the Weberian monopoly on legitimate force that poses a challenge to academic freedom, but the very breadth and scope of the state's helping hand. The fact that the state acts as regulator that in ways that enable academic speech, the fact that the state, this is particularly true in the United States, acts as funder for both public and private entities. Those facilitative roles mean that the state poses a threat to academic freedom that perhaps it would not have done 100 years ago. So that's the premise that I want to start out with, and then I want to offer two observations about the argument that he makes. So the first is that Professor Mehta asks what the social conditions are under which threats to academic freedom emerge, particularly from the state. And in parts of his remarks, he identifies the availability as a matter either of law or public culture of blasphemy or the concept of group or status-based offense as the basis for silencing or liability, as a ground, as a breach in the dam that facilitates or opens up into a broader attack on academic freedom. And I want to challenge that. There are many jurisdictions in which blasphemy is a crime. I grew up in England, where blasphemy was an offense until 2008. I can remember instances in which works of art were shut down because of blasphemy concerns. Blasphemy was a crime in Scotland until 2021. In other jurisdictions, there are offense-based regulation through the criminal law. Chapter 7 of the German Criminal Code, which covers offenses against public order, defines and punishes Volksverhetzung, which is the incitement to hatred based upon group identity. It is not at all clear to me that either the legal or the cultural construction of citizenship around ideas of, or in ways that recognize the possibility of group-based offense necessarily leads to a cracking of the bounds of academic freedom. To offer a further example that underscores the point, the assault on academic freedom that transpired in Hungary in 2017 with the enactment of amendments to that country's Higher Education Act occurred in the absence of any kind of argument from status or group-based regulation. To the contrary, it was an argument that proceeded through the purely regulatory functioning, or it was an amplification of the regulatory role of the state that was designed explicitly to target and to extinguish what the Fidesz government called Soros U. The inference that I would draw from these examples is that academic freedom comes under threat, and this echoes something that Professor Mehta says, not necessarily when a legal or a public culture has ideas of group-based offense, but where a political culture takes an anti-pluralist turn. I don't think that that's only in instances in which there is a personalist leader, like an Orban or a Modi. The Polish example is one in which a politics of anti-pluralism is hitched to a party rather than a person. The second point that I want to make moves from Professor Mehta's question about why academic freedom attracts so few defenders. And I want to approach that question through the lens of a very famous essay paper by the sociologist Robert Merton from 1936, entitled The Unanticipated Consequences of Purposive Social Action. And I want to suggest that academic freedom, like democracy, concede the conditions of its own destruction. Let me give you two examples of that. And they come broadly from the United States rather than from the Indian continent. So recently, the legal philosopher David Dysenhouse at the University of Toronto has written a number of eloquent pieces about the way in which anti-pluralist ideas migrate from margins into the political center. And he has described the way that anti-pluralist ideas developed first in the pre-war German academy by Carl Schmitt and Eric Voegelin, physically, and in Voegelin's case, and through translation and transmission in Schmitt's case, made their way into first the American Academy, and in particular into the American Legal Academy, and became the justification in American political practice for resisting or limiting academic freedoms or the recognition of the rights of pluralist mediating institutions such as universities. So the way that Dysenhouse does this is that he tracks the movement of, in particular, Voegelin's ideas through the academy into a document written by a sitting US senator called A Christian Vision for Kingdom Politics. Kingdom politics, lest it be misunderstood, does not include a place for robust academic freedom. Here's a second, perhaps unintended effect. One might ask whether a defense of academic freedom along one of its several fronts can have the perhaps unintended effect of corroding academic freedom along a different front, where indeed the threats to its existence are more serious. Here is a stylized example of how that dynamic might work. So in the United States, there have been many criticisms over the last few years of student protests and student complaints with respect to speakers who are identified by the students in question, I'm not making a value judgment, as intolerant or otherwise inappropriate with respect, or inappropriate participants in a public debate on an academic campus. And the criticism that's made of these students is that they are acting at odds with academic freedom, and the criticism is distilled into the word woke. The students are criticized for being woke. A concern with wokeness, however, can be turned, and it can be deployed against another kind of academic freedom. So a concern with wokeness can be turned into a justification for limiting the curriculum in both secondary schools and tertiary education. It can be, and has been, invoked as a justification for eliminating the management, ousting the provost, not something that you would have any familiarity with, of a college in Florida called New College. Notice the echo or the parallel with the point that Professor Mehta makes about how censorship of academic ideas is often not really about silencing those ideas. Right? Often the censorship itself has the inadvertent, perhaps intended effect of elevating the public prominence of those ideas because it's actually serving another end. In the stylized story that I just offered, the actions of those who purport or maybe genuinely seek to defend academic freedom along one margin becomes the fuel, the energy, the intellectual and rhetorical justification for suppressing academic freedom along another margin. So we can call this, along with Merton, I think, an instance of short-termism, or we might think that it is something a little more purposive, a little more sinister. Whatever interpretation one gives of these unexpected dynamics, they do raise the question of why we would expect others, the general public, politicians, to rise to the defense of academic freedom when we are doing such a good job of destroying it ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Mehta. Thank you, Professor Huck, for those comments. We will now open the floor to questions. We have a microphone so that everyone may hear the questions. Let's start here. If you'd wait for a moment, and we'll bring the microphone. You're good.
Loud voice, so I'll use my loud voice that I got in theater in high school. But so my name is Navya Kupusetti. I'm a first-year MPP student here at Harris. So my question is, what do you think about, like, when professors use their own textbooks to teach? Like, I feel like that kind of limits, like, the academic freedom there, because, like, I don't know, like, I feel really weird about that, like, when professors use their own content to teach, because, like, I feel like there's a lot of, like, academic knowledge out of that certain professor's scope. So what do you think about when professors use their own textbook? Because I have one class called Analytical Politics, and, like, the professor used their own textbook to, like, teach the class, so I'm just really curious about that.
Okay. I think you should try and write up a petition to the FTC whether this is an exercise of a form of monopoly power, and try and work out how that argument works.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
Good afternoon, professors. My name is Vincent. I'm a first year of the college. I have a question about kind of like the expansion of freedom, academic freedom from the institution to the general public. Like, in a totalitarian society, apparently when one says something controversial, one gets persecuted and problem solved. But like in a democratic society, I feel like when, like, say for example, public intellectuals say something very controversial, it also faces this problem of being misunderstood. say, for instance, handed around, it's like misunderstood by people like who don't really understand what she's talking about. So, and then society kind of forms this like court of public opinion, and like the general public get mobilized. So I was wondering, even in a democratic context, should like public intellectual be courageous enough to just say whatever they will say in a relatively safe, institutionalized context, where they're supposed to like take a step back and only provide the less radical version of their ideas? Thank you.
You want to? It's a very big question. I think there are three different aspects to the question, right? One is, sometimes in authoritarian societies, actually academics have more freedom than the general public. I mean, there is a way in which those regimes make a distinction that so long as you're not engaged in explicit organized political activity, we need to know what you're thinking or what analytical perspective in the world is. Although usually those equilibriums don't last too long. I mean, but there are protracted periods where it is the case that sometimes academics are actually more privileged than the general public. I think the second important element in discussions of freedom more generally, in academic freedom, that I think we place less stress on is our discourse on these matters has become much too administrative and much too juristic, right? And in part, it suggests to me a fundamental breakdown of institutional trust. So even in a university, in a worst case scenario, I mean, it's quite possible that there are things professors are saying that are extremely offensive or material that's being assigned that ought not to be assigned. You would have thought that if the classroom was a place of that trust, that fact itself could be a teachable moment, right? A student comes to the teacher and says, look, professor, this is just, crazy, this, right? What puzzles me about, I think, what's happening to institutional cultures across a number of universities is why it ascends to an administrative, legal, or public censoriousness immediately. I mean, it's one thing to say, okay, we did not get recourse, there's a professor we could not talk to, we were completely shut out. But the fact that the insertion of these debates into judicial and administrative paradigms has become sometimes the first kind of recourse, I think actually does a lot of disservice, because I think the law and administrative practices are extremely blunt instruments when it actually comes to thinking about the nuances of what is actually involved in particular situations. And so there needs to be a bit more, in a sense, discussion, you might say, about the conditions of trust, and you might say the ethics of expression, rather than the administrative practice and the juristic claims of expression, right? And I think the same thing applies to then public argument. I think people should have the courage of their convictions. They should not, in a sense, hold back in some ways, right? But I think the most important challenge for anybody speaking publicly these days, there are two challenges, right? One is, of course, we are in a context where everything can be decontextualized and recontextualized. In a sense, you actually don't have control over the meaning of what you're saying. I mean, it's literally and we can talk about why that is the case, right? But I think more importantly, and this is true of academics in particular, the most important tool we have, right, or the thing we ought to cherish apart from our freedom, is our credibility, right? Now, credibility is very easy to lose in some ways, right? I mean, it takes one transgression, it takes one ill-thought tweet, right? And don't be surprised then when people read the rest of your work in light of that transgression, right? So I think there's much less discussion about what is it that makes for actually credible expression, right? Over the course of the long run, as it were, right? That can provide some restraints, but those are restraints that are internal to the cause of pursuit of credibility and truth. In fact, I think in public perception, right, in politics, the most important category is actually not the content of what you say. It is the credibility with which, in some senses, you say it, right? And the institutional building up of credibility has always been important to regimes of truth. And I think we need to think about how do you continue to preserve that in a context that is actually so fraught with kind of censoriousness and decontextualization and so forth.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Mehta. That was a really enriching talk. My name is Kritika Ashok, and I'm a PhD student in anthropology and law. I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about this crisis of credibility within the social sciences specifically. And on one, at one level, of course, it seems kind of inevitable because ideas of history and is something that, there are popular narratives which will, which are likely to come in conflict with academic narratives. So at one level, it seems inevitable almost that social sciences would regularly face these kind of crises of credibility. And I wonder what your thoughts are on what exacerbates it at particular points in time. And particularly, I was wondering, what is it? Is it also reflective of kind of the elite control over academic spaces in South Asia and India specifically? So that was one part of my question. And on this question of crisis of credibility, I also wondered where law falls in all of this, because, it's interesting that in these circumstances, so often the language of constitutionalism, of the Constitution itself, of rights, often come up. And I wonder if in this crisis of credibility, often law seems like a somewhat more, a less, uncredible form of discourse. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Feel free to come in. You're probably, this would require a whole seminar. And, I do want to say one thing in response to what Professor Huck also said. I think, you made a terrific point. So let's look at this from the outside. And I think, as academics, sometimes I think we are so convinced of the superiority of our own practices and our credibility that we sometimes, I think, don't engage in that act of empathetic imagining of how our practices look at from the outside, right? You might say, Ernest Gellner used to have this nice line that, academics treat everybody as tribes. Academic progress will occur when academics are treated as tribes, right? And there's a couple of aspects to, I think, that thing, which is that, we talk about the pursuit of truth. And I actually believe that most academics are committed to that. I don't think it's a question of sort of they're opportunistic, they're evil or malign or anything. But I think the way we have sold what that actually entails, right, I think exposes us to a charge of hypocrisy and not promising what we are delivering. I actually think the best diagnosis of modernity, I don't want to go as politics, but I actually think Alistair McIntyre got pretty much everything about the diagnostic predicament about inquiry exactly right, that even the pursuit of truth actually comes out of traditions of inquiry. There could be methodological, there could be disciplinary. There's no, and that doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. I mean, that's the interesting fine line, right? That you can actually be, you can think of conceptual pluralism without actually being a relativist, right? But what that means is that within any given university or given within any disciplinary set of disciplinary paradigms, you will never be able to redeem the promise of diversity that you start out by, right? I mean, it's conceptually incoherent in some ways, right? And that's not a disadvantage for academia, because that is how the pursuit of truth actually in some senses takes place. But when you sell truth with a capital T, right, it just exposes, I mean, just to be a little bit cynical, how many Marxists does Chicago have is a question a lot of people are going to ask, right? Or you can think of equivalence in many other contexts. The three things I mentioned, right? Partiality is one, which is our attention is always selective. And as Max Weber said in some senses, right, the charges of the exercise of disciplinary power excluding other perspectives is often just at the level of questions and subjugated knowledges. It's not about truth claims, right? And in countries like India, that's a huge issue, where you're talking about the marginalization of languages, the marginalization of historical traditions of knowledge, right, in some ways. What is the relationship between our social scientific modes of inquiry and these other forms of knowledge, right? So I think we have to do a better job of communicating that truth has become a slogan in our hands rather than actually explaining what is it about our practices that we think, in a sense, produces that. And as I said, I think the crisis in the public perception is more with the social sciences and humanities, right? And I actually do think it is a serious crisis. I think we are deluding ourselves if we think that just the defense of truth with a capital T as a slogan is actually going to redeem the credibility of these professions in the eyes of the larger public, right? On law, very quickly, I think in India, the crisis of credibility of law is even worse than the crisis of academia. In fact, the biggest and most shocking disappointment has been not just the abdication of the judiciary, but the abdication of the bar in not even fighting for the mere formality of law, right? In some ways. And I think it goes to the question of exemplarity, that ultimately the way you create credibility is, again, we are all very sophisticated at ticking off the right boxes in what we say. Every single lawyer in India and judges, they're super smart, right? And yet there is a crisis of exemplarity there, right? And it's an interesting psychological question. How does credibility get built up? Right? I don't think it's just a matter of the force of the argument, right? It's the force of the argument, who it comes from, what that, because ultimately these are relationships of trust.
Well, I think we could go on much more. This is an incredibly rich conversation, but we are up against our time limit. And so before we conclude, I want to invite everyone to one other potential event if you are interested in the ideas of free expression, its justifications and challenges. This afternoon, our own Chicago Journal of International Law is hosting an online symposium about the subject of free speech in the digital age. It's an outstanding program with leading scholars addressing issues of propaganda, speech regulation in Europe, and the implications for democracy. I encourage you to join it if you wish. You can just go to law.uchicago.edu/events to register and join online. But I'm especially grateful for this spectacular event this afternoon. Thank you, Professor Mehta. Thank you, Professor Hart.